She was a piece of freight left on the dock, a parcel returned for insufficient postage. The sun beat down on the raw plank of the general store's porch, and she was tethered to one of its support posts with a length of coarse rope. Her feet were bare, the soles cracked and stained by the dust of a town that did not want her. The calico dress she wore was frayed at the hem and clung to her thin frame like wet paper, its pattern of faded flowers a mockery of life in a place so parched. She did not cry. Her eyes, the color of a washed-out sky, were fixed on a point somewhere beyond the dusty street, beyond the false-fronted buildings and the heat that shimmered over the ground in waves. She had learned that stillness was a kind of armor. Noise and tears only invited more trouble. So she stood, a silent statue of disgrace, while the man who had brought her here, Silas Blackwood, held court. Blackwood was a man whose voice was too loud for any room he stood in, a man whose presence filled a space with the smell of cheap whiskey and self-satisfaction. He gestured at her with a sweep of his hand, as if presenting a disappointing horse. "Paid good money for passage," he boomed to the small clutch of onlookers. "Promised a wife I was, someone to work, keep a home. This one, she's got a ghost in her." Silent as a stone, a few of the townspeople murmured. A woman in a severe black bonnet clucked her tongue. A boy, emboldened by the spectacle, threw a small pebble that landed in the dust near her feet. She did not flinch. Her world had shrunk to the tight circle of the rope around her wrist and the unforgiving heat of the sun on her head. She was an object, a lesson, a mail-order bride who had failed to please. The crowd was a shifting thing. Some stared with pity, their faces soft with a second-hand shame. Others wore the hard masks of judgment, their gazes sharp and accusing, as if her failure was a personal affront to the decency of the whole town. Most, after a moment, simply lost interest. She was just another piece of sorrow in a land that had plenty of its own. Their attention drifted back to the price of feed, the threat of drought, the small, grinding concerns of their own lives. Then he came. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who measured his life in seasons, not days. Elias Thorne. He didn't join the loose circle of watchers but stood off to the side, by his wagon, one hand resting on a sack of flour. He was a man made of dust and leather, his face a map of long winters and lonely summers. His coat was worn at the elbows, his boots scuffed and gray. He carried whole winters in his eyes, a quiet that was deeper and heavier than hers. He watched Blackwood preen and posture. He saw the woman tied to the post. He saw the way she held herself, a single, straight line of endurance against the world's contempt. He saw the small, dark bruise blooming on her cheekbone, a violet shadow against pale skin. He said nothing. He simply observed, his expression unreadable, his jaw set. Blackwood was growing tired of his own voice, the afternoon sun souring his temper. "I'll be rid of her," he declared. "Send her back on the next stage, if they'll even take her." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust, dangerously close to her bare feet. That was when Elias moved. He did not stride or march. He simply closed the distance, his steps making almost no sound in the thick dust. He stopped in front of Blackwood, who was a head shorter but twice as loud. The small crowd stirred, sensing a change in the weather. "What you want, Thorne?" Blackwood sneered, puffing out his chest. "Come to have a laugh." Elias's gaze did not flicker. It rested on Blackwood with the weight of a winter stone. His voice, when it came, was low and rough like it came from under floorboards. "What did you pay for her passage?" Blackwood blinked, thrown. "What's it to you?" "I'm asking." The words were not a threat, but a statement of fact. There was no room for argument in them. $20, Blackwood said, a note of blustering pride in his voice. "And worth half that, the useless thing." Elias reached into the pocket of his worn trousers. His movements were slow, methodical. He pulled out a small leather pouch and loosened the drawstring. He counted out the coins into his calloused palm. 2 heavy silver dollars and the rest in smaller denominations. He held them out to Blackwood. "I'll take her," he said. The statement hung in the hot, still air. It was not a plea. It was not a bargain. It was a transaction. Blackwood stared at the money, then at Elias, his mind working slowly. He saw no charity in Elias Thorne's face, only a kind of grim resolve. It was an easy way out of a situation that was beginning to embarrass him. He snatched the coins from Elias's hand. "She's your problem now," Blackwood grumbled, pocketing the money. He turned and swaggered toward the saloon, his part in the drama finished. Elias did not watch him go. His attention was on the woman. He stepped toward her and she flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Her eyes finally met his, wide and wary, like a cornered animal's. He stopped, giving her space. He reached not for her, but for the post. From his belt he drew a small, sharp pocket knife. The blade clicked open, a clean, definitive sound in the sudden quiet. With one smooth motion he sawed through the rope. The fibers parted with a soft rasp. The severed end fell into the dust. The rope, no longer taut, slid from her wrist, leaving a raw, red mark behind. She was free, but she did not move. Elias folded his knife and slipped it back into his pocket. He gave a slight nod toward his wagon. "Come on," he said. It was not a command, but an invitation. She hesitated for a long moment, her gaze darting from his face to the wagon, to the faces of the few remaining townsfolk who watched, their curiosity reignited. She took a tentative step, then another. The dust was hot beneath her bare feet. The journey to his homestead was a long study in silence. The wagon creaked, a rhythmic complaint against the weight of the supplies. The wind whispered through the tall, dry grass that bordered the track, a sound like ghosts sharing secrets. Dust lifted behind them like a pale, following spirit. He sat on the driver's bench, his hands steady on the reins, his eyes fixed on the horizon. She sat in the back, among the sacks of flour and beans, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She watched the back of his head, the way the sun bleached the hair at his collar. She watched the broad, solid set of his shoulders. He did not look back at her. Not once. The silence stretched, thin and fragile, between them. It was not an angry silence, not like the one she had known with Blackwood. This was something different, an open silence, a waiting silence. After an hour, the sun high and merciless, he pulled the horses to a halt. Without a word, he reached for a canteen that hung from the side of the wagon. He uncorked it and drank, then held it out to her over his shoulder. Her throat was a knot of thirst. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was rough, calloused, but there was a warmth to it that surprised her. She drank, the water cool and tasting of metal and mercy. It was the first kindness she had known in weeks. She handed it back, her throat too tight to form the word, "thank you." He seemed not to expect it. He corked the canteen and set the horses in motion again. His home was not a house so much as a suggestion of one, carved from the unforgiving landscape. It was a small cabin of weathered, silvered wood, sitting alone in a wide expanse of pale earth and sky. A single, stoic cottonwood tree stood guard beside it, its leaves rustling in the constant wind. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. There was a barn, listing slightly to one side, and a set of corrals, their fences mended in a dozen different places with a dozen different kinds of wood. It was a place of stark functionality, stripped of all ornament. Off to the side, under the shade of the cottonwood, was a small, fenced plot of land. Inside it, a single wooden cross stood tilted in the hard-packed earth. A grave. The sight of it sent a small, cold shiver through her, despite the heat. He brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down. He began to unload the supplies, his movements efficient and practiced. She slid from the back of the wagon, her bare feet sinking into the soft dust. She did not know what to do, where to stand. She was a trespasser in this kingdom of quiet. He carried a sack of flour to the cabin door, pushing it open with his shoulder. He returned and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since the town. His gaze was assessing, not unkind. "You can sleep in there," he said, nodding toward a small room just inside the door. No one will bother you. I don't lock doors. He went back to his work. The unspoken contract was laid. Food, shelter, safety. He asked for nothing in return. She stood for a long moment, the wind whipping strands of her pale hair across her face. Then she walked to the cabin and stepped over the threshold, from the harsh, bright sun into the cool, shadowed interior. The days settled into a rhythm, as quiet and steady as a slow heartbeat. They moved around each other like two planets in a silent orbit, held in place by the gravity of the small homestead. He rose before the sun, his boots thudding softly on the packed earth floor. He would milk the single, sway-backed cow, feed the horses, and head out to the endless task of mending fences or clearing stones from the stubborn fields. She would wake to the sound of his departure. The cabin would be empty, but a piece of dry bread and a mug of milk would be waiting on the rough-hewn table. At first, she did little. She stayed in the small room he had given her, a space that held nothing but a narrow cot and a single high window. It smelled of dust and old wood, but the fear that had clung to her like a shroud began to recede, frayed by the edges of this profound and unending quiet. Slowly, she began to claim a space. She swept the floor of the main room, the swish of the broom a defiant sound against the silence. She washed their 2 plates, their 2 mugs, their 2 forks, and set them to dry on a clean rag. She found a patch of neglected ground behind the cabin where some hardy herbs still fought for life. She began to tend to them, her fingers sinking into the cool, dark earth. One afternoon, she walked to the small, fenced-in grave beneath the cottonwood. The wooden cross was weathered, the name carved into it almost lost to the sun and wind. Eleanor. She knelt and, with patient fingers, began to pull the stubborn weeds that grew around its base. When she was done, she found a single tough prairie wildflower, a splash of defiant yellow, and laid it on the packed earth. Elias saw it when he came in from the fields that evening. He stopped by the grave, his hat in his hands, and looked at the solitary flower. He said nothing of it when he came inside for supper, but she saw the way his eyes rested on her for a moment longer than usual. They stitched their new life together with such raw, unspoken threads. He noticed the handle of the water bucket was splintered and spent an evening carving a new one, smooth and fitted to a smaller hand. She saw a tear in the shoulder of his work shirt and, finding a needle and thread in an old tin box, mended it with small, neat stitches. He looked at the repair that night, his rough finger tracing the line of her work. He nodded a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. One evening, a chill wind turned mean outside, rattling the window frames. He built up the fire in the stone hearth until it threw dancing shadows on the walls. She was huddled on a stool nearby, wrapped in a thin blanket. He disappeared into his room and returned with a heavy wool shawl, woven in dark, earthy colors. It was old, but clean and soft. He draped it over her shoulders without a word. The wool was warm and smelled faintly of lavender and memory. She pulled it tighter around herself, a fortress against the cold, and the coldness inside her. Their first true conversation was born from failure. She had taken some of the flour he'd bought, determined to contribute something more than mended shirts. The result was a loaf of bread as hard and unforgiving as the land itself. It sat on the table between them, a dense, sad lump. He cut a piece with his knife, the effort making his knuckles turn white. He chewed it thoughtfully for a long moment. She watched him, her stomach tight with shame, expecting scorn. "A little dry," he said, his voice level. She flinched, staring down at her hands. He took another bite. After a moment, a faint glimmer of something, humor, maybe, touched the corner of his mouth. "You didn't complain about mine." Her head snapped up. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw the winter in them recede, just for a second. A small, startled sound escaped her lips. It might have been a laugh. He cut another piece of the terrible bread and ate that, too. That night, the silence in the cabin felt less like an absence and more like a shared space. The breakthrough, when it came, was violent and sudden. She woke to the sound of her own screaming. Darkness pressed in on her, thick and suffocating. The small room was a box, the door a sealed lid. She scrambled from the cot, her hands clawing at the wooden planks. The memory of ropes and locks and Blackwood's heavy breathing, a living thing in the room with her. "Don't lock me in," she gasped, sobbing, rattling the door that was not locked at all. She heard his footsteps, heavy and slow, stopping just outside. He did not try the handle. He did not speak for a long moment. She could feel his presence through the wood, a solid, calming weight. "You're safe." His low voice came through the door, steady and calm. "No one locks doors here, remember? The door opens out." Her frantic scrabbling stopped. The door opens out. She fumbled for the latch, pushed, and it swung open into the moonlit main room. He was standing several feet away, a tall, solid shadow against the dying embers in the hearth. He held a rifle loosely in one hand, but it was pointed at the floor. He had come ready to face a threat, only to find the threat was inside her. She stood there, trembling, wrapped in the heavy wool shawl. He did not move closer. He simply stood his ground, a silent guardian in the dark. "Just a dream," he said, his voice softer now. She nodded, unable to speak, pulling the shawl around her as if it could hold her together. He waited until her breathing slowed, until the trembling subsided. Then, he leaned the rifle against the wall and went to the hearth, adding a small log to the embers. A weak flame flickered to life. He gestured to the stool opposite his own. Hesitantly, she came and sat. They sat in the growing warmth, the firelight painting their faces in shades of orange and gold. "Why?" she whispered, the question tearing itself from her throat. It was the question she had carried all this way. "Why did you take me?" He stared into the flames for a long time, his face carved by shadow. He looked old and immeasurably tired. "My wife," he began, his voice rough. "Eleanor. She got sick. A winter fever. We were alone out here. The snow was too deep for the doctor to get through. I watched her fade. There was nothing I could do. Nothing." He picked up a small piece of kindling and began turning it over and over in his hands. "When I saw you in that town, tied up like an animal with everyone just watching," he shook his head, not looking at her. "I couldn't help Eleanor, but I could cut a rope." The confession lay between them, simple and devastating. It was not about her. Not really. It was about him, about the ghost he lived with. And yet, in that moment it became about her, too. He had not seen a useless bride or a piece of property. He had seen a person who needed help, and his own past had compelled him to act. A tear, hot and sharp, slid down her cheek, the first she had shed in this place. She did not wipe it away. In the flickering light of the fire, in that small, weathered cabin surrounded by a vast and empty land, two broken people sat with their ghosts, and for the first time, they were not entirely alone. The peace they had built was as fragile as a skim of ice on morning water. It was shattered by the sight of three riders on the horizon, their forms dark and sharp against the pale blue sky. They were not wandering cowboys or lost travelers. They moved with a purpose that made the air grow thick and still. Elias was splitting wood by the barn when he saw them. He stopped, the axe held loosely in his hand, his body going rigid. He watched the dust cloud they raised, a dirty plume that crept steadily closer. She came to the doorway of the cabin, a bowl of shelled peas in her hands. She saw the direction of his gaze and followed it. The bowl slipped from her fingers, scattering the small green pearls in the dust. The blood drained from her face, leaving it as pale as bleached bone. She knew who it was. The past had come to collect. Silas Blackwood rode at the head of the small party, his posture arrogant even at a distance. The two men with him were hired muscle, their faces hard and indifferent. They reined in their horses a dozen yards from the cabin, turning the homestead into a battleground. "Thorn," Blackwood's voice sliced through the quiet. "I've come for my property." Elias did not answer. He walked slowly from the woodpile and stood in the open space between the barn and the cabin. He placed himself directly in the path to the door where she stood, a silent, unmovable wall. "I paid you," Elias said, his voice low but carrying in the still air. "A refund?" Blackwood sneered, dismounting. He tossed his reins to one of his men. "I've had a change of heart. A man's entitled to what's his. The law says she's mine. I paid her passage. She's bound to me." He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on her. "Get your things, girl. What little you have." She shrank back, the familiar, cold terror coiling in her stomach. Her gaze flew to Elias. His back was to her, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. He was all that stood between her and that old life. "She's not property," Elias said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. "And she's not going anywhere." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Is that so? You and what army, old man?" He gestured to his men, who shifted in their saddles, their hands moving closer to the pistols at their hips. "You want to die for this silent little mouse? She ain't worth it." He started to walk past Elias, reaching for her. "Come on, now. Enough of this foolishness." And that's when she moved. The terror was still there, a wild thing beating its wings inside her chest, but something else rose with it. The memory of quiet mornings, the feel of the warm wool shawl, the taste of water from a canteen, the sight of a man eating her terrible bread just so she would not feel ashamed. It was a foundation, thin but solid, and she stood on it now. She stepped out from behind Elias's shadow. In her hand, she gripped a heavy piece of firewood she had been about to carry inside. Her knuckles were white, her arm trembling, but she held it like a weapon. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. It was thin and it shook, but it was there. It was hers. "No." The word, a single, clear syllable, stopped Blackwood in his tracks. He turned, his face a mask of disbelief. He had never heard her speak more than a fearful whisper. He looked from her defiant face to the piece of wood she held, and he laughed again, but this time it was uncertain. Elias did not turn to look at her, but a change went through him. The rigid line of his shoulders softened, just for an instant, as if a great weight had been shared. He was no longer standing for her. They were standing together. "You heard her?" Elias said, his voice taking on a new edge, a hard, sharp finality. "This is my land. You are not welcome here. Leave." Blackwood looked from Elias's unyielding face to the woman's strange, newfound fire. He looked at his two men, who now seemed less like a threat and more like hired hands waiting for a paycheck. This was not the easy victory he had imagined. There would be a fight here, a real one. And for what? A woman who now looked at him not with fear, but with something that looked dangerously like contempt. His pride was a big thing, but his cowardice was bigger. He spat on the ground. "She's broken goods anyway," he snarled, trying to reclaim the last word. He swung himself back onto his horse, tugging the reins viciously. "Keep her. You deserve each other." He wheeled his horse around and kicked it into a gallop, his men following close behind. They rode away, shrinking back into the dust from which they had come. Silence descended again, heavier than before. The wind sighed through the cottonwood. The world returned to its normal rhythm. She stood there, the piece of firewood still gripped in her hand, her arm aching. Elias turned to her. He looked at the wood, then at her face. His own was unreadable, a landscape of deep-carved lines. He reached out and gently, carefully, took the piece of wood from her hand. His fingers closed over hers for a brief moment. The touch was warm, solid, real. He looked down at her hand, now empty and trembling. "You didn't run," he said quietly. She shook her head, a single, sharp movement. She finally found her voice again, though it was barely a whisper. "I was scared." "I know," he said, and in those two words, she heard everything. He had been scared, too. That evening, the sun bled a bruised, blood-orange light across the horizon. They sat on the rough plank of the porch, not touching, but occupying the same space, breathing the same cooling air. The world felt wider, quieter. The threat was gone, but it had changed the landscape between them forever. "I don't know your name," he said into the twilight. She looked at her hands, resting in her lap. The name she had been given felt like it belonged to another person, to the girl tied to a post, to the freight left on the dock. That girl was a ghost. "They called me Anne," she said, her voice small. Elias considered this for a long time, watching the first stars begin to prick the deep purple of the sky. "That name has seen enough hurt," he said finally. His voice was soft. "It seems to me a new start deserves a new name. Out here. You look like a Lena." Lena. She tried the name out in the quiet of her own mind. Felt clean. Unwritten. It was a name without a past. A name given not by a clerk or a master, but by a man who had seen her stand her ground with a piece of firewood. She looked at him, at his weathered profile against the fading light. "Lena," she whispered, tasting the sound of it, tasted like hope. The next day he went into the small room that was hers, the room that had once belonged to Eleanor. He took down the faded, water-stained curtains from the window. He did not burn them or throw them away. He folded them carefully, with a strange reverence, and placed them in a wooden chest at the foot of his own bed. He was putting a piece of his past to rest. Later that week, Lena found a small bundle of dried sage she had collected and tied it with a piece of twine. She hung it by the newly bare window in her room. It was a small thing, but it was hers. A piece of her own making in this house of ghosts and silence. The house was changing. It was beginning to breathe again. Winter came, burying the world in a deep, cleansing blanket of white. The silence of the snow was different from the silence of the dust. It was a soft, insulating quiet. They spent the days inside, close to the hearth. He carved small, intricate animals from scraps of wood. She mended their clothes, her stitches now confident and even. They talked more. Not much, but enough. They shared stories not of their deepest wounds, but of small, simple things. The best way to stack firewood. The name of a particular star. The memory of a favorite song. They were building a new life, not on the ashes of the old one, but alongside it. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. One night, sitting by the fire, he was carving a small, graceful bird. Lena was watching the flames, the wool shawl, her shawl, draped over her shoulders. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full. It was comfortable. It was home. She reached out and rested her hand on his arm. He stopped carving. He looked at her hand, then up at her face. Her eyes, no longer the color of a washed-out sky, were clear and deep in the firelight. He turned his hand over and laced his rough, calloused fingers through hers. They just sat there for a long time as the fire crackled and the wind howled its lonely song outside. In the small, warm cabin, two solitary souls had found their way not out of the wilderness, but through it. Together, the house was no longer a hollow thing. It was full. It breathed with the slow, steady rhythm of a shared life. A quiet hope tended like a low and steady fire against the cold. This story, it ain't just about rescue. Rescue is a single act, a rope cut, a coin paid. This is about the quiet, patient work that comes after. It's about building a home inside the walls of another person's kindness until you're strong enough to build a home of your own, right there beside them. It's the story of how a person isn't a name they're given, but a name they grow into. So here's your naming. It's the moment you realize that your worth is not decided in the town square, by the noise of the crowd, but in the quiet places, in the steady gaze of someone who sees not what you were, but what you are. It's in the hand that offers water without asking for thanks. It's in the shared silence that says, I am here with you in the dark. We all have a wilderness. We all carry our ghosts. But if you're brave enough to pick up your own piece of firewood, if you're brave enough to speak your own name into the quiet, you might just find that you're not standing in it alone. You might just find you're building a home there,